Hey, I'm Francis, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of How to Start a Dungeon Synth Project. First of all, thanks for coming to the video. Thanks for coming to the channel and checking out my content. If you are new here, I've got a bunch of stuff like this and a bunch of stuff that's nothing like it, and I hope you can tolerate both. Anyway, last time we got through a mix of the first song for my new Dungeon Synth project that I'm starting on this series, and we did a print of it in my session. And I said at the end of the video that we'd look into mastering it, which we will do today. I'm not going to call this the final master by any means, because mastering is a process that sort of needs to be done for the distributed product. So if this is going into a collection of songs, I am going to need to prepare it for that collection of songs. Most of the processing is likely to stay the same, but I need to essentially make sure all the songs sound like they go together in the project if it were going, say, on a cassette. I also had a few questions in the comments of the first 2 episodes of this season, and I'll try to get to those as well. One of them was asking about whether or not I would go into audio editing in this series, and I wasn't initially planning to, but I will do a little bit of that. I'll try not to spend too much time with it, and maybe I'll make some other videos on the subject, but in the context of making a project like this, it probably would be helpful. So I won't skip that. And the other question was asking about running a mix through tape or through a tape simulator. And that, in this case, would be part of my mastering process. If I wanted to make the finished product sound like it was done on tape, I'll go through some ways that I would consider doing that. So let's take a look at where we left off. So here's the mix that I printed. These are the tracks for it. If you want to see how I made those and you're just getting here for this episode, check out the playlist this is in, and episodes 1 and 2 of season 2 of How to Start a Dungeon Synth Project are going to have the way I made that. This is the print. I have some processing on it. This processing was what I was mixing into last time. That was on my master bus. But today, since we're actually going to try doing some mastering, I have this bus blank and I have this here just so we can hear it the way it sounded. This right here is my default mastering chain. This is if I want a song to sort of sound mastered in the context of the background of a video or something like that. And I may or may not have just dropped my default mastering chain on this because I was trying to get the video up in time last week or the week before. May or may not have happened, who knows. But let's just have a quick listen to refresh our ears to a portion of this. The first step of this is really just listening. I would rather be listening on monitors than on headphones, but in the context of this video, that's not going to be an option. All right. It sounds pretty good overall. I'm still happy with my mix, and it's good to give yourself a break. In this case, I haven't really listened through this for about a week since I finished and uploaded the second episode of the series. I waited as long as I could. It's currently the Friday before I'm putting this up, which is, like about 12 hours before, right? So usually I try to make my videos in advance. This time I wanted to make sure I would do a good job on this one, and I procrastinated. And I recommend that you do the same when it's an option. So my first step here is going to be pulling this limiter off so that I'm only hearing the processing on my actual master bus. So there's a few tools that we can use for mastering, but before we decide on a tool, we need to think more about what mastering actually is. And in a genre like Dungeon Synth, I'm not going to give you the old, hire someone else to do it advice. unless you're distributing on something like vinyl. Some formats are a lot less forgiving than others, and I think that it's important to recognize that in a genre like Dungeon Synth, there's usually no budget on the project, and asking someone to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on mastering might not be a helpful piece of advice. And I know most of you, just like me, are doing it ourselves, and maybe I've just been doing it longer and you can learn something from me. Maybe I can learn something from you. If you've got any tips or if you think anything I'm doing in here is questionable, let me know and let's talk about it. I'm always trying to improve my craft. Mastering is basically preparing audio for distribution. If you really break it down, that's really all it is. That usually involves a lot of nuanced steps, but at the end of the day, we're providing a finished recording, and that recording is being provided to DistroKid or Bandcamp or SoundCloud or YouTube or something like that in order to make it accessible to other people. In some situations, it's going to be an analog master, which is going to be provided to a CD replication plant or a vinyl pressing plant or a cassette facility. Maybe we're going to dub our own cassettes and we'll make a master cassette and then we'll copy that, and those copies will be what we'll sell. These are all essentially different approaches to mastering. And if we're making a digital master and we're going to convert it to one of these formats, that's another thing to keep in mind. So in this case, I'm only going to be working on a digital master. And after I'm happy with my digital master, I'll think about what I would change, if anything, for other formats. So let's dive in and get started. So the first thing that I like to do, especially when I'm working in headphones, is to use some type of analyzer to assist me in frequencies that I might not be hearing correctly. In Reaper, we have Frequency Spectrum Analyzer. It's a pretty good one, and it's free if you have Reaper. So that's an option. Reaper's EQ also has this. That can be useful. All this stuff you're seeing on here is the result of my voiceover. It's really noisy in here right now, isn't it? Let's hear what it sounds like without that. Sweet silence. So obviously, if I'm using this type of a tool, I'm going to have to turn my mic off when I'm working with it. Makes it a little bit harder. That's why I haven't done a video on mastering yet. I've been avoiding it, and I decided I might as well just show my process, even if you can't really hear what's happening clearly, because it is part of the process of making this stuff, especially when you're self-releasing and self-producing. So with this on, I want to see if there's any big gaps in my frequency range and see if there's any big spikes or resonances. And at my age, and maybe at your age, even if you're a bit younger than me, you're going to stop being able to hear some of this stuff up here. Human ears kind of go bad at a relatively young age because you don't really need this stuff to survive at all. Once you stop hearing some of the stuff over here, that can start becoming a problem. But losing the top end, you're not even going to perceive that as hearing damage usually. You won't even notice. But if you're like 19 and you watch this video and I am making some horrible, horrible sound in the top end, sorry, I can't hear it. Anyway, I'm going to mute the mic and play this back, and we're going to take a look at what the analyzer shows. Okay, so it looks like there's a great deal of consistent information in the mid-range and the low end, and there's not a lot in the high end, which is actually probably good for this style. When you have something that's like lo-fi or like low fidelity or something like that, oftentimes you're losing information on the top and bottom end, and that's how you get to have that soft, hugging you kind of a feel. It's less exciting, but it's also sometimes more comforting sounding. It's almost like comfortable synth or something. Maybe I'll start a new genre. Actually, I probably won't. That sounds like a ridiculous idea. Anyway, let's think about what would happen to the sound if I boosted that high end. I'm going to throw an EQ on, and I'm going to put a shelf at the top. It's going to affect my voice too. Isn't that fun? Wow, it's me. Hello. Hello. Hello, hello, hello. Okay. I've had my fun. I also have a high pass on by default in my EQ. I don't necessarily want that here. So I'm going to put that on bypass and double clicking the band. The reason that's there is I don't usually use this EQ for mastering. I'm using this right now because it is something that comes with Reaper. So if you're following along and you use Reaper, cool. Here's an EQ. Again, bypassing my voiceover and adjusting the high end to see what that does to the sound. So I think that my choice here is going to be subjective. Neither one of those sounded horrible to me, and I like the idea of taking all the top end out, makes it sound more lo-fi, and I like the idea of making the top end more exciting, makes the strings stand out, and the strings I think sound really cool in this recording. I think that's a decision I'm going to save for later. Another thing we can do is to explore the amount of low end. The synthesizer I'm using has a great deal of low end, so I'm going to hear what it sounds like with a little bit less of that. Again, using a shelf. So let's hear what that sounds like, bypassing my mic. Again, it sounds kind of cool both ways. This, I definitely prefer the boosted bass or the neutral bass, and that's just because I like hearing that synthesizer in the bottom end. I remember adding it to my mix to fill in that space. So I am definitely going to leave that at the very least flat. So once we get our song sounding the way we want, we can add something like a limiter to get it to the desired volume that we want. You can hear that gets louder and louder the lower I set the threshold. This is reducing the dynamic range of the recording. So again, we can mute my mic so this isn't reading in the meters, and this is reading true peaks, and we can see how loud do we actually want it. Down here, I have my meter set to check loudness, and there's a bunch of settings in here to check loudness. We can also check peaks and RMS. This is all new features in Reaper. It's pretty cool, actually. Anyway, the plus that we see here is, well, that's reading peaks still. What's going on? Mix top readout loudness. Okay. So basically, you can set the offset to have the meter like normalize at whatever place you want. I'm setting it to 20. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think Dungeon Synth sort of feels like background music in a video game, which is usually going to be like quieter than this. I used to master my Dungeon Synth kind of loud and like it was a metal recording or something like that. I don't like the way that ends up turning out at all, though I haven't done that for a while. Happier because of it. Anyway, let's turn my mic off and adjust the threshold of this limiter and see what that does to the sound. It should just make it louder until we start hitting the peak, at which point it's going to squish the peaks of the waveform and sort of flat top them, which is going to make it seem bigger and louder, and eventually squeeze it all together and get it distorted and eventually sort of ruin it. We don't want to get to the point where we ruin it, but we also don't want it to be too quiet because there's background noise in any system, electrical noise if it's on a cassette, the tape hiss, and we don't want the tape hiss to be louder than the song. I've almost done that before, and that can be a huge issue. So, without further ado, so you can see that once I got it down to around this space, the reduction starts working. And that's because we're hitting our limit of minus 0.1 decibels, and the limiter is starting to actually do its job. It's basically just making the song louder up until that point. And we could take it down further, and that's going to get pretty extreme. Let's just hear that real quick for reference. Bass boosted. Right. A true classic. Anyway, what we can do is essentially set our loudness meter to a value that we think is appropriate and try and get the limiter to match that loudness. Don't listen to people that tell you need to master for Spotify at a certain LUFS level or something like that. That's it's not really true. Spotify sets your tracks to a target loudness, so it's good to know what they sound like if you set your track to that target loudness. But newsflash, it's going to sound like your track with the volume turned up or down so that all the songs are turned to the same volume. That's really all it's doing. So if your recording sounds good, it'll probably sound good on Spotify. Let's explore what happens with a simulation of tape. I am going to start with something that comes with Reaper, and then I'm going to just explore a couple of plugins that I recommend. So a saturation plugin is going to emulate some of the things that tape will do, primarily the saturation, not necessarily the EQ characteristics. I'm also going to hit the limiter here and turn my mic off. Subtle, but I like it. I think it sounds good. Okay, now for the fun stuff, the plugins that I paid for. Everyone loves buying effects, synthesizers, plugins, all kinds of stuff. So let's just explore a couple of tape simulations that I like. Starting with, this one's probably the best one for something like Dungeon Synth. Again, subtle on appropriate settings. We could get pretty inappropriate with it. I showed you what the top of these knobs all sound like, and the reason I keep them all so subtle. The static control just sounds like the hiss of tape. The shape control just sounds like damage, essentially. The magic control is sort of a stereo chorusing effect. And the mix control creates a chorusing effect as well, just because the drift adjusts the pitch. I didn't adjust this one, but it's basically just a chorus. That's what it sounds like. This one is designed to emulate VHS tape sound, which is, I think, a great sound. I grew up with it. We can actually see, if we want, what that looks like in a spectrum analyzer, which I think can also be kind of exciting. So we'll see what this does to the sound. Let's just look at it one more time. It's all pretty subtle, but the big thing I was noticing was a dip in the very top end and a boost somewhere in the low mids. Very, very subtle. But again, delightful if you're looking for tape saturation. Okay, that's the Super VHS by Baby Audio. None of these manufacturers are sponsoring this video or involved in any way, just so everyone knows. I'd be happy to get paid to do this stuff, but I'm not right now. Okay, Super VHS. Let's go to Waves J37. I love this one. This one sounds so good. I have the default setting set to the tape machines offset from each other to create tape delay. It's wonderful. It's just so cool. I love it. Anyway, Dun, 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 dun. Off. Okay, cool. Now it's just tape. Now it's just tape on bypass. And let's hear the music with it. Okay, all kinds of delightful effects with the tape, and essentially these are different formulas, which would be like the type of tape that you're using. Believe it or not, this stuff doesn't grow on trees. You have to make it. Speed is the speed at which the tape travels across the machine. I guess the idea is that if you are going twice as fast here, 15 is twice as fast as 7.5, right? Then you have less time running to get through the whole reel of tape, but essentially twice as much space to store information. So it should be higher quality. And the formulas are different quality as well. I don't know if you could tell, but the distortion on this 811 formula is quite a bit more noticeable than on the 815 formula. And these are basically just very complicated DSP, digital signal processors, and I don't understand a lot of what's going on. Just straight up, like, no idea what's going on, but some of it sounds pretty magical. This stuff over here is obviously creating like warp in the tape or damage, and I think that can sound really cool too. This is the level that the noise is at. Kind of fun. So another great simulation of tape. Any of these could be pretty cool for Dungeon Synth. I think I've got another one in here. Massey tape head. Let's try this one. Oh, I don't have it anymore. Cool. That's a pretty good one too. Really, really simple one. I don't know if they even make it in VST anymore. And then this is the last one I've got, is Ozone 9 vintage tape. This one is very resource intensive, so it delays my audio when I'm using it on a video screen recorder. So I'm going to mute my mic and see how well I can do with it. So the most subtle of the bunch, I think. I was really hitting some of these settings pretty hard and not hearing enormous amounts of difference, but usually that's what you want if you're going for sort of a hi-fi tape sound, is very little difference, because at the end of the day, a really hi-fi tape is going to be higher fidelity than a digital recording, aside from the hiss that you get. So if you were able to completely remove the tape hiss, or you had a really, really quiet reel of tape, you're getting more fidelity out of tape, because instead of samples, you're getting an analog signal. This is existing outside of the realm of like possibility of human understanding though. You're not going to hear the difference. You're going to hear that it is different in some way, but you're not going to be like, oh, that's tape and it's better. You're just going to hear that it sounds like subtly different. So if you had a favorite of these, in the comments. Maybe I'll switch it later on if everyone liked one and I didn't like that one. In this case, I think I'm going to stick with a sort of hi-fi-ish sound, And I'm going to go for the medium hi-fi, the J37, where it still sounds like definitely a tape machine, whereas the Ozone one sounds a little bit too good for what I'm going for. So I'm going to leave that in my chain here and ditch these other ones and dial that in. A lot of these also have really great presets, so I'll just pick one of these mastering presets as a starting point. And let's just hear that and see if it's a good starting point. So I like this one, and the 811 was a little bit too hard on the saturation, but it might be more to someone else's taste, I think, especially in Dungeon Synth. But like I said, I want to keep this one relatively hi-fi sounding, so I'm going to leave it on the 815 setting. I turned the saturation up a little bit because I want a little bit of that saturation. I want it to sound more like it's, intentionally being distorted a bit on tape. And that's about as far as I'm going to go with it. Another thing that can be really good in a mastering chain is some type of way of squeezing your low frequency into mono. This is really, really important if you're mastering to something like vinyl. Some formats really need the bass in mono, but I think it helps make stuff punch through, even in a digital recording. So I recommend trying it. There's a lot of great free plugins that do it. I think I've got one in here called GMonoBass. This is a free plugin, and it just squeezes everything into mono. So let's hear what that sounds like. I'm going to set it to 20 hertz, which we're not going to be able to hear. And width is the percentage of stereo change. So setting it to everything that we can't hear is in mono, and I'm going to slowly tune it up until it's almost everything that we hear clearly. So the funny thing about this type of a processor is that it actually makes stuff sound a bit smaller. And I used to think smaller was always worse until I started listening to recordings in the context of speaker systems that I had. I don't really know what I was thinking. It's like whenever I'm making music, I've got like a wide stereo field, and as soon as I'm listening to it on another device, I don't. And making everything sound focused and tight is usually more important than making it sound big and wide. A good workaround for that is a more complicated stereo field plugin. And one that I'm very fond of is the Ozone, what is it called? Ozone Imager. Let's hear what this one sounds like. So basically what this lets us do is add bands, and we can adjust the stereo field of the space in each band. So in this case, I had around 250 hertz in mono, and to recreate that in this plugin, I would choose somewhere around 250 hertz and squeeze that into mono. Let's hear what that sounds like. So in that situation, almost the same as GMonoBass. So fancy plugin versus free plugin. Oftentimes the difference isn't that big. And that's really important to know when you're getting into this stuff, is that just because you see me using expensive fancy tools doesn't mean you have to do that to make good music. And I'll be the first to admit that some of the music I make isn't good. A lot of it isn't. I mean, the worst of it I don't even release or put on these videos. Sometimes I'll make a YouTube video and not even put it up. So something that we can do here, though, in these fancier plugins, and I'm sure there's a good free plugin. I'll see if I can find a good free plugin that does something like this. Part of the reason I use this one is because you can load it up in one instance of Ozone with a bunch of other stuff. You can see in my chain here that in the Ozone plugin, you can load the tape and the imager, and the maximizer is just like the master limiter. And you can put an EQ in it. So it's a sort of a whole mastering chain in one. Sometimes I'll add other stuff to it. Sometimes I'll just use Ozone. It's great. Strongly recommended if it's in your budget. So what we can do with this is to essentially adjust the stereo field of different bands. So in this case, let's just do an example. We'll set a band at 7K and at 1K. And we're going to make everything wider from 1K to 7K and make it just really wide on the top end because there's not much going on here. So we'll just force that to the edges of the speakers. And we can keep band 2 more or less where it was. I'll adjust that one during the playback because most of what we're hearing, the fundamental frequencies of the song, exists in this space. So this is going to essentially damage the integrity of the mix the most. Let's give it a listen. So really not much at all going on up here in band 4 and a whole lot going on down here in band 2. Band 3, there's a good deal going on as well. And I sort of use this as an extra phase of my mix. You can get a lot of this work done in your mixing phase. This is a really lazy way of doing it. I enjoy it because I like doing my panning by frequency range. So the style of panning that I like, this works really well for. I don't really like wide guitars, but I like really wide reverb. And a lot of my mixes, if you hear them, they're in, a lot of it's in mono actually, but the effects are in stereo. And contrast that with a lot of modern pop mixes and heavy metal mixes, stuff like that. They're just super wide. All of the mid-range is really, really wide. And it sounds huge. It sounds awesome. But it's not my favorite style. So I like to just do it more this way. I actually liked band 2 a little bit wider. So I think I'm going to tune that in. But before I do that, I'm going to turn my tape simulation back on to make sure that I like the way it sounds with the saturation this is adding. This might add some excitement to the high end. I'm also going to get rid of this one because I'm not going to use it. I'm going to get rid of this one as well because I'm not using it anymore. And I am probably going to use a dynamic equalizer instead of a regular equalizer. So I think I'm going to get rid of this as well. We'll get to that in a second. So. Okay, I scaled that back a little bit because I thought it was making it sound too different from the original recording. I want to keep it sounding similar to where it was, and I also don't want it to get super wide sounding because I'm wearing headphones, so everything sounds wider anyway. And if I go back to monitors, I don't want it to be like weird. Actually, now's a great time to reference in monitors. What am I doing? I'm muting my mic anyway when I play it back. So I'm going to do that right now. Awesome, I like it. I think this is a good setting. So the other tools that I tend to use in mastering are things like dynamic equalizers and multiband compressors and limiters and maximizers. So let's explore both of those things. This is a really good dynamic EQ. Another really good one is from FabFilter. And a dynamic EQ is basically an EQ that only works when it needs to. So it's not going to be a tone shaping tool as much as it is almost like a dynamic processor. Let's explore what this is doing. This one's great because it actually gives you feedback. This white line in the middle is going to represent the actual work that the equalizer is doing, as opposed to the shape of the band. So you can see I'm pushing this down, and here's my threshold. And essentially, once I go beyond the threshold, it's going to start working. And it's going to be a lot more subtle than a regular equalizer as a result. So bypass my voice again, and let's hear it. Okay, the important takeaway here, and the reason I chose a dynamic equalizer, is because of the low end. I know that my monitoring system can't be trusted with very low end. One of the next major upgrades I'm going to make to my home studio is better monitoring, and I haven't figured out what that means yet. So that's why I haven't done it. It's going to involve spending probably a bunch of money on stuff that seems ridiculous to people on the outside. But I've made enough mixes that I saved to the last second by referencing on a different speaker system and realizing, holy shit, I put too much bass in this. This is usually a culprit. These things have a lot of low end that exists sort of below the frequency range that my speakers can confidently reproduce. So it might involve different studio monitors, it might involve adding a subwoofer, it might involve treating my room differently or moving my desk. So we're not sure what that is going to look like, and when it happens, I'm going to do a bunch of videos on it. I'm going to be really excited. But until then, something I do know is that this song has a great deal of low end in these sections and not a lot in these sections because the synth stops playing in those. So a dynamic EQ is going to turn down those places when they get really loud. So it's going to turn down the bass when the bass is playing, but it's not going to cut low end out of the other instruments, which is exactly what I want. And that makes it a good mastering processor because it is not going to be as invasive as a regular tone shaping EQ. I'll show you what that would sound like real quick again for reference because it's a big difference. So I'm pulling out a few decibels below 300 hertz, like 2 or 3 decibels. Something like this, right? So let's hear that. Now to recreate the same setting, we could probably get it closer, but as a point of reference, I was really just wanting to show you how much more extreme a regular equalizer can be than a dynamic equalizer on a master track. So I like that. I think that I want to place that equalizer before the imager. I'm not sure if that'll make a huge difference, but I imagine that attenuating my low end before putting it into mono is probably good. If that's the wrong placement, or if you are a mastering engineer that got this far in this video and you disagree with this placement, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. I am always trying to get better at this stuff and exploring different options. Anyway, the last step here in this process, I think that I want to do is to add a maximizer to get to my target volume. And I haven't decided what my target volume is because I don't know what format I'm putting this on. I would make this much quieter, for example, as a background music for a video than I would if I was putting on a cassette or on Spotify. We will use a couple of these actually. Let's try a few limiters. Okay, I just dumped a bunch of limiters on here, and let's just pick a similar setting on each of these. I'll just 3 decibels threshold. Okay, and we're just going to hear all of these and see if any of them add character that we like or dislike. And we can explore some of the other settings as we go. So I'm going to play the song back and mute my voice. Okay, of these, obviously this one's got the most additional character. This one's, oh, I just realized I have a bunch of these other modules on, that's why. Let me turn off the ones that aren't the limiter and try that again real quick. Okay, that's much better, much more similar to the other options at least. Anyway. I liked a lot of those for different reasons. I really think this is the best one at just making the track the right volume. It's transparent to my ear, and it just sort of adjusts the level of the track. So if you wanted your track to get really loud, oftentimes you cascade these, you use more than one. A lot of people will put, if they're using Ozone, I've seen people put vintage limiter before maximizer and do a little bit of each to taste, right? It's like, it doesn't really matter. Most people can't tell the difference. I think a couple of these sound more or less the same to me as well. Placebo goes into it. Which one looks the coolest to you? I like the controls on this one because there's no bullshit. I like using this one when I want to pretend like I'm using a hardware studio. I like using this as a signal processor more than as a mastering processor. I'll throw this on like a vocal or something like that too. Again, it's a chain, sort of like Ozone, where there's multiple modules and you can do cool stuff with this. It's great for drums, making your drums sound like they were running through an old console. A really great plugin, but I don't think it's the right one for this particular day. So if you have a preference between these, let me know in the comments. And I am going to make a decision. And then we're going to set the loudness to basically be hitting right where it's jumping into the red on this meter. This meter isn't actually peaking when it's red, it's just going over the level that I've set it to. So let me turn this off and get it going. Okay, and that's the settings that I ended up going with in headphones while I'm filming a video. Expect me to adjust them to taste on my own time. The final recording won't quite sound like that either because I won't be running it through a stream. That's about as good as I can do with the equipment I have of a video on mastering. I wish I could show you more, and maybe I can in the future. But for now, I think that's enough to get you started and to get you mastering your own Dungeon Synth projects. Because let's be real, very few of us actually have any funding behind our Dungeon Synth projects, and it's great to be able to get them going and get them started as a solo artist without help from others. Essentially, once you get through that process, you'll just render it out. You can add whatever metadata you want. If anyone's curious about that, I could show you the kind of metadata that I tend to add. But these days, most services that distribute music will add metadata for you. So you don't really need to do that even. You can get away with just bouncing it out and sending a WAV file. So hopefully that was helpful to some of you. And in our next episode, we'll probably get started on our next track. And because I already did this mastering processing, I can probably work a lot faster now that I have a feel for what my project actually sounds like. So I like to start working more factory style, where I'll make a few tracks at the same time. And then before you know it, you have an EP or an album. So I hope you like whatever I come up with. And more importantly, I hope I like it. And you should think that way too when you're making your own music. So I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.